The most desired magnate in America chose his ugliest maid as his wife, and no one knew why. New York City, autumn of 1882. The brass knocker on the Whitmore mansion's entrance struck with a finality that echoed through Clara Brennan's bones as she stood trembling on the threshold of Fifth Avenue. September rain had dampened her coat, a threadbare thing of grey wool that had belonged to her mother, and droplets fell like tears from the brim of her hat onto the marble steps beneath her worn leather shoes. She had arrived in this city only 3 weeks prior, fleeing the tenement fire that had claimed her family's meagre savings and her own sense of belonging to the world. Now, at 6 o'clock on an autumn evening, she stood at the servants' entrance of one of New York's most magnificent residences, clutching a letter of introduction that promised employment as a chambermaid. It promised, too, anonymity. It promised that she might disappear into the machinery of service and never again be forced to see the revulsion in another person's eyes when they glimpsed the scars that consumed half of her neck and shoulder. Before we continue, I invite you to subscribe and turn on the bell. On this channel, we bring back romances from past eras where honor, destiny, and love shaped the course of life. The housekeeper who opened the door was a severe woman named Mrs. Ashton, her grey hair pulled so tightly against her skull that her face seemed stretched, her mouth a thin line of perpetual disapproval. She examined Clara with the clinical detachment of a butcher appraising meat. Her eyes lingered on the burn scars, and Clara watched with familiar resignation as the woman's expression shifted from neutral to something harder. Something that contained pity and disgust in equal measure. Mrs. Ashton did not comment on the scars. She did not need to. Her silence said everything. The mansion swallowed Clara into its depths, a labyrinth of corridors and staircases that seemed designed to disorient rather than welcome. Her shoes clicked against polished marble, and then against dark wooden floors covered with Persian rugs that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. Crystal chandeliers cast harsh light over everything, illuminating the impossible wealth of this place with merciless clarity. Oil paintings in gilded frames depicted stern-faced men and beautiful women draped in fabrics that shimmered like captured moonlight. This was another world entirely, a realm where the air itself seemed to carry different molecules than those breathed by ordinary people. The servants' quarters occupied the basement level, a dim and labyrinthine warren of small rooms connected by narrow passages that smelled of coal smoke and boiling linens. Clara was assigned a room no larger than a closet, containing only a narrow bed, a small wooden chair, and a washstand with a chipped porcelain basin. The window, set high in the wall, looked out at street level where the feet of passers-by moved ceaselessly past. This would be her world now, this small grey room and the endless corridors above it, where she would move through the chambers of the wealthy like a ghost, visible only when her labour was required, invisible the moment her task was complete. The other servants regarded Clara with a wariness that bordered on cruelty. She learned quickly that in the servant hierarchy there were grades of acceptability, and those with visible afflictions occupied the lowest rung. The housemaids whispered when she passed. The footmen averted their eyes. Even the elderly cook, a woman named Mrs. Donnelly, who might have shown her mercy out of fellow feeling for a countrywoman, seemed uncomfortable in her presence. Clara understood without being told that her scars were contagious in some way, that proximity to her might somehow diminish others' worth. On her second day, she was assigned to clean the upper chambers, the private rooms of the Whitmore family. She moved through spaces of almost incomprehensible beauty and waste. In the sitting rooms, fresh flowers were changed daily, even though they still retained their fragrance. In the bedchambers, linens were changed twice weekly, regardless of necessity. The quantity of fabric, of silk and satin, and the finest Egyptian cotton seemed designed to mock the poverty from which she had come. Clara cleaned these rooms with meticulous care, her hands moving across furniture and fixtures with the reverence of someone handling sacred objects, because in a sense, they were. These objects represented a world to which she could never truly belong. It was in the library that she first encountered Harrison Whitmore in the flesh, rather than as an abstract presence felt through household gossip and the servants' fearful whispers. She had entered to clean the shelves, her small cloth and tin of polish clutched in her trembling hands, believing the room to be empty. He stood at the window, his back to her, silhouetted against the grey afternoon light. Even from behind, he communicated authority and wealth with every line of his posture. His shoulders were broad beneath a charcoal jacket of impeccable tailoring. His hair dark and gleaming with pomade, his stance that of a man accustomed to commanding every room he entered. Clara froze, her breath caught in her throat. She should have retreated, should have left the room immediately, but something held her fixed. Perhaps it was the unexpected loneliness in his posture, the way his hand rested against the window pane with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the ruthlessness attributed to him. For a moment, Harrison Whitmore appeared not as a distant legend, but as a man, a person capable of softness and solitude. Then he turned, as though sensing her presence, and their eyes met across the vast expanse of the library. Clara felt the weight of his gaze like a physical force, and she instinctively turned her face away, positioning herself so that her unscarred profile was toward him. She had become expert at this small geometry of shame, this constant rearrangement of her body to conceal the evidence of her own inadequacy. Harrison did not speak. He merely observed her for a moment that felt stretched and eternal, his dark eyes unreadable, and then he returned his attention to the window. Clara completed her task in trembling silence and withdrew from the room, her heart thundering against her ribs. She told herself that his gaze had contained nothing but the casual appraisal a man of his station might offer to any servant. She did not allow herself to consider that perhaps it had contained something else, something that might have been curiosity, or even, impossibly, a moment of genuine seeing. That evening, alone in her small grey room, Clara lay on her narrow bed and pressed her fingers against the scars on her neck, tracing their familiar geography in the darkness. She had survived the fire that created them, but she had not survived with her soul intact, and in this vast mansion on Fifth Avenue, surrounded by wealth beyond imagination, she understood that she would spend her days invisible and her nights remembering what it felt like to matter. 2 months had passed since Clara Brennan entered the Whitmore household, 2 months of moving through corridors like a wraith, of making herself smaller and quieter with each passing day. October had transformed into November, and the city outside the mansion's windows grew colder and greyer, the trees along Fifth Avenue surrendering their leaves to the indifferent wind. Clara had developed a rhythm to her invisibility, a practiced art of existing without truly being seen. She rose before dawn, dressed in her uniform of black cotton and white apron, and moved through the chambers of the wealthy performing tasks that demanded precision but never acknowledgement. The household buzzed with preparations for an event that consumed the attention of everyone above stairs. Miss Vivian Ashford was to be married to Mr. Harrison Whitmore in the spring, and though the wedding remained months away, the engagement had already transformed the mansion into a repository of endless anticipation. Swatches of fabric arrived weekly, bolts of silk and satin in shades of ivory and cream that Mrs. Ashton allowed certain maids to glimpse before they were locked away in the linen room. The drawing rooms overflowed with floral arrangements celebrating the union, with champagne left untouched in crystal flutes that Clara was instructed to empty and polish. She had seen Miss Vivian only twice, both occasions when the young woman had passed through the halls like a golden dream, her laughter crystalline and her beauty so absolute that it seemed almost unreal, a fabrication of light and fabric rather than flesh and blood. Harrison Whitmore had become a more frequent presence in the mansion, though Clara had learned to navigate her duties in ways that minimized the possibility of encountering him. She had refined her peripheral vision to an art form, could sense his approach through the vibration of footsteps on marble and the way servants scattered in his wake like startled birds. That single moment in the library had rendered her hyper-aware of his existence, had transformed him from an abstract authority figure into something dangerously real and present. She did everything in her power to ensure that such an encounter would not happen again. So it was with profound shock that on a cold November afternoon, Mrs. Donnelly approached Clara in the servants' kitchen with an unexpected request. A delivery was being made to one of Mr. Whitmore's steel mills in Brooklyn, and the cook's daughter Eleanor had fallen ill with influenza. Someone needed to accompany Mrs. Donnelly to carry the heavy baskets of food and warmth to the workers. Mrs. Donnelly's eyes held a hint of apology as she asked, and Clara understood immediately that she had been chosen not out of capability, but out of convenience, because the other servants had found excuses to be elsewhere. The mill was a revelation of an entirely different world. The factory occupied an enormous brick building that seemed to stretch endlessly along the waterfront, and as Clara and Eleanor approached, she heard the sound before anything else, a terrible primal roar of machinery and fire that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. The ground beneath her feet vibrated with the rhythm of the industrial process. The air smelled of metal and heat and something chemical that burned the inside of her nose. Through the high windows, she glimpsed figures moving like shadow puppets against the glow of furnaces, and she was struck by the realization that this was the source of Harrison Whitmore's power. This inferno of human labor and molten metal that transformed raw materials into the instruments of American commerce. They were escorted into the facility by a foreman who moved with the confidence of a man accustomed to this dangerous landscape. The heat intensified as they progressed deeper into the building, until Clara felt as though she were walking into the literal chambers of hell. The workers who gathered around the baskets of food were blackened with coal dust and sweat, their eyes bright and strange in their darkened faces. Some were barely more than boys, their young bodies already bearing the mark of years spent in this inferno. Clara found herself overwhelmed by compassion and horror in equal measure, by the knowledge that these men were being consumed by their labor in ways both visible and invisible. It was as Eleanor was distributing bread and cheese that the disaster struck with the sudden violence of an unleashed god. A furnace on the far side of the mill began to rumble with a sound different from the normal rhythm of the machinery, a sound that made the experienced workers visibly tense. Then came the explosion. A rupture in the furnace sent a wall of flame racing across the factory floor, with terrifying speed, consuming everything in its path. Workers screamed and scattered, but the fire moved faster than human legs, a living beast of orange and crimson that seemed to hunger for destruction. Clara watched in horror as the familiar figure of Harrison Whitmore, who had apparently been conducting business within the facility, became separated from his companions as smoke billowed and obscured visibility. She heard his voice calling out, heard the desperation in his shout, and something moved within her that overrode reason, that overrode fear, that overrode every instinct for self-preservation. She began to move toward the smoke and flames. Eleanor grabbed her arm, screaming her name, but Clara tore herself free. She wrapped her skirt around her face as protection against the heat, though she knew the gesture was largely futile. The fire was an entity unto itself, a force that consumed oxygen and light and hope. She moved through it as though in a fever dream, her senses heightened beyond anything she had ever experienced. She heard his voice again, clearer now, and she pushed toward the sound with desperate determination. She found him collapsed near a support beam, overcome by smoke inhalation, his body moments away from being crushed by falling debris. Without thought for consequence, Clara seized his arm and began to drag him toward what she hoped was an exit. The heat was overwhelming, pressing against her like a physical weight. Her dress caught fire at the hem, and she barely noticed as she extinguished the flames with her hands, her attention fixed entirely on the imperative of removing Harrison Whitmore from this burning tomb. The beam fell just as they reached the edge of the conflagration, and Clara threw her body across Harrison's to shield him from the worst of the falling wreckage. Pain bloomed across her back and shoulders, a sensation so absolute that it transcended pain itself and became something almost abstract. She felt the skin of her neck and shoulder ignite with fresh agony as the flames found the scars already embedded there, as if the fire recognized the damaged flesh and claimed it as particularly its own. Then they were through, stumbling into cool November air that felt like a blessing beyond measure. Workers rushed toward them, shouting, pulling them away from the inferno. Clara felt herself being lifted, felt the chaos of rescue and panic surrounding her, and then she saw Harrison's face, saw the absolute terror in his eyes as he looked at her, saw him reaching for her as consciousness began to slip away like water through her fingers. Then there was only darkness, infinite and complete. The hospital ward smelled of carbolic acid and human suffering, a combination that had become the entire world for Harrison Whitmore in the 72 hours since the fire had stolen Clara from consciousness. He sat in a wooden chair beside her bed, a chair that had become as familiar to him as his own skin, his dark eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She lay motionless beneath white linen sheets, her breathing shallow and irregular, her body wrapped in bandages that covered not only the new burns from the fire, but also the older scars that had defined her before this catastrophe had redrawn the geography of her suffering. The attending physician, Dr. Samuel Chen, had explained with clinical precision that Clara would recover, that her injuries, while severe, were not life-threatening. The pneumonia that had followed her exposure to smoke and heat was the true danger, Dr. Chen had said, his voice carrying the measured calm of a man accustomed to delivering news that oscillated between hope and devastation. Harrison had listened with only half his attention, because none of the medical facts seemed to matter compared to the simple fact that Clara lay before him in a state of unconsciousness, her body fragile as spun glass, her survival dependent on the whims of forces beyond human control. His mother had arrived at the hospital within hours of receiving word of the fire, her carriage racing through the streets of New York with the urgency of a woman accustomed to having her will imposed upon the world. Margaret Whitmore swept into Clara's hospital room like a force of nature, her dark eyes assessing the situation with the rapid calculation of a chess master contemplating an opponent's position. She had examined Harrison's face, had observed the way his hand rested near Clara's on the bed without quite touching, and her expression had hardened into something unforgiving and absolute. The confrontation had come swiftly. Margaret had demanded that Harrison leave the hospital immediately, had insisted that his presence in Clara's room was generating dangerous speculation among the hospital staff and the city's gossip columnists. She had suggested, with the particular cruelty that only a mother could muster, that Harrison was indulging in an emotional reaction brought on by trauma and gratitude, that his concern for the maid was entirely misplaced and would fade with remarkable speed once he returned to his normal life and his proper obligations. Harrison had refused. The word had emerged from him like a stone cast into still water, creating ripples that seemed to disturb the very air of the room. He would not leave. He would remain at Clara's bedside for as long as his presence might serve some purpose, whether that purpose was medical or merely moral. Margaret had stared at her son with an expression of mingled disbelief and fury, her mouth opening as though to unleash further arguments. And then she had turned and departed the room with the stiff-backed dignity of a woman whose authority had been questioned and rejected. The hours that followed blurred into one another with the monotony of waiting and worry. Nurses moved in and out of the room with practiced efficiency, changing bandages, checking Clara's fever, administering medications that seemed to help very little. Harrison sat vigil through these intrusions, watching the careful ministrations performed upon the woman who had saved his life, who had thrown herself into fire without hesitation or calculation, thinking only of his safety while her own burned away. On the second night of his vigil, exhaustion had finally claimed Harrison. His head had dropped forward onto the mattress beside Clara's hip, and he had fallen into an uneasy sleep filled with nightmares of flames and screaming. He had awakened suddenly in the dark hours before dawn, his heart racing with the terror of abandonment, and found himself reaching for her hand with a desperation that shook him to his core. She remained unconscious, her fingers cool and still in his grasp, and he had pressed his forehead against the back of her hand and allowed himself to weep with an abandon that his position and breeding should have forbidden. Vivian had appeared on the afternoon of the third day, her arrival announced by a rustle of expensive silk and the lingering scent of French perfume. She had floated into the hospital room with expressions of concern that seemed carefully calibrated for maximum theatrical effect. She had extended her gloved hand to Harrison, had expressed her shock and worry about his ordeal, and had suggested with delicate persistence that perhaps the stress of his experience was affecting his judgment regarding his obligations. The engagement to Vivian seemed like something from another lifetime, a commitment made by a different man in a different world. Harrison had watched her perform her expressions of sympathy and concern, and he had felt absolutely nothing. Where once he might have appreciated her beauty, he now saw only the carefully constructed artifice of her presentation, the deliberate arrangement of fabric and cosmetics designed to create an impression of perfection. It struck him, as he looked at her, that beauty without compassion was merely decoration, that all the silk and jewels in the world could not compensate for the absence of genuine feeling. When Vivian had finally departed, disappointed by Harrison's monosyllabic responses to her conversational offerings, he had felt profound relief. He had returned his attention entirely to Clara, to the impossible task of willing her back to consciousness through the sheer force of his desire for her survival. Dr. Chen had visited late that afternoon, his examination of Clara professional and thorough. He had listened to her breathing through a stethoscope, had checked the wounds beneath the bandages, and had given a slight nod that suggested cautious optimism. Then he had turned to Harrison with an expression of careful neutrality, and had asked, in a voice so quiet that it could barely be heard, whether Harrison was aware of how deeply his presence at this woman's bedside was being noted and discussed throughout the hospital. Harrison had replied that he did not care. The words had emerged with absolute conviction, and as he had spoken them, he had realized that they represented a fundamental truth about his current state of being. He did not care what society thought. He did not care what his family whispered in drawing rooms. He cared only that Clara should recover, that she should return to consciousness, that she should have the opportunity to continue living the life that her courage and sacrifice had earned for her. Dr. Chen had nodded, and for a moment something had passed between the two men, a recognition of shared compassion that transcended the usual boundaries between physician and patient's family. The doctor had placed a hand on Harrison's shoulder before departing, a gesture of silent support that had meant more than any words could have conveyed, As the evening descended into night, Harrison had repositioned himself in his chair and had taken Clara's hand once more, holding it with the tenderness of a man who had glimpsed something true and beautiful in another human being and could not bear the thought of its extinguishing. He had whispered words that he would never have dared speak if she had been conscious, words about her courage and her worth, words about the unexpected way that she had entered his life and transformed everything he thought he understood about value and beauty and the meaning of genuine connection. In the darkness of the hospital room, with only the sound of Clara's labored breathing and the distant sounds of the city outside the windows, Harrison Whitmore had made a silent promise to a woman who could not hear him. He would spend whatever time remained to him ensuring that she understood her own value, that she would never again believe herself to be unworthy of love and respect. It was a promise that would reshape the entire trajectory of his life, though he did not yet know it. Now I invite you to leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this exciting story. Clara awakened to the sound of rain against the hospital window, a gentle percussion that seemed to belong to another world entirely, one where fires did not consume the innocent and where the architecture of one's life remained predictable and whole. Her eyes fluttered open to a ceiling of pale cream plaster, and for several moments she existed in a state of profound confusion, unable to reconcile her consciousness with the reality of her circumstances. Her body felt heavy and distant, as though it belonged to someone else, and when she attempted to move, pain bloomed across her shoulders and neck with such intensity that she gasped and fell back against the pillows. It was then that she realized she was not alone. Harrison Whitmore sat in the chair beside her bed, his head tilted back against the wooden frame, asleep. His appearance shocked her almost as much as the pain that consumed her body. He was unshaven, his dark hair disheveled in a manner entirely at odds with the meticulous grooming she had observed in the few glimpses she had caught of him before the fire. His jacket was wrinkled, his collar unfastened, and there were dark circles beneath his eyes that spoke of days without proper rest. He looked diminished somehow, reduced from the untouchable Magnate of her observation into something more vulnerable and human. Clara attempted to remain absolutely still, unwilling to disturb his sleep, but the simple act of breathing caused her bandaged shoulders to shift, and the resulting pain prompted an involuntary sound of distress. Harrison's eyes opened immediately, as though he had been existing in a state of half-sleep, despite his exhausted appearance, alert to the slightest indication of her consciousness. For a moment, he simply stared at her, and Clara watched as emotion flickered across his features in rapid succession, relief so profound it seemed almost to break him, followed by something tenderer and more complicated that she could not name. He rose from the chair with the stiffness of a man whose body had been confined to an uncomfortable position for an extended period. He moved to her bedside with the careful deliberation of someone approaching something precious and fragile, and he took her hand with a gentleness that made her heart contract in her chest. His fingers were warm and strong around hers, and he held her hand as though it were the most important thing he had ever possessed. The words he spoke were simple and direct, asking about her pain, her comfort, whether she required water or assistance. His voice was hoarse from disuse, and there was something in his tone that suggested emotions running far deeper than simple concern for a servant's welfare. Clara attempted to respond, but her throat was parched and raw from the smoke she had inhaled, and her voice emerged as barely a whisper. Harrison immediately fetched water, supporting her head with one hand while he held the glass to her lips with the other, and the intimacy of the gesture, the casual assumption of care and physical proximity, made her deeply uncomfortable in ways she could not articulate. When Dr. Chen arrived for his morning examination, he was visibly pleased by Clara's recovery of consciousness. He checked her wounds and her vital signs with professional competence, and he made comments about the remarkable resilience of youth and the body's capacity for healing. He seemed entirely unsurprised by Harrison's presence at the bedside. Though Clara was acutely aware that this situation was highly irregular, that a man of Harrison's station should not be spending his days and nights in the hospital room of a servant. It was after Dr. Chen's departure that Harrison made his declaration, and it arrived with the force of a thunderbolt striking from a clear sky. He seated himself on the edge of her bed, maintaining his grip on her hand, and he looked at her with an expression of such intensity that Clara felt pinned beneath his gaze like a butterfly to a display board. He intended to marry her, he said. The words emerged with absolute certainty, spoken as though he were announcing a business decision rather than something that would reshape the entire architecture of both their lives. Clara's first response was to assume that fever had addled his mind, that the trauma of the fire had temporarily unbalanced his reason. She attempted to refuse, her voice growing stronger as indignation and disbelief gave her oxygen. She argued that he was suffering from gratitude confused with something deeper, that he would regret such a decision within weeks, that accepting would destroy his reputation and his prospects for a suitable marriage. Harrison listened to her protests with a patience that seemed almost infinite, and when she finally exhausted her arguments, he spoke with a quiet conviction that was somehow more powerful than any vehemence could have been. He told her that she had given him something far more valuable than his life. She had shown him what genuine courage looked like, what authentic feeling felt like, what it meant to have another person's welfare matter more than one's own safety. He told her that he had spent 35 years fulfilling the expectations of others, that his engagement to Vivienne had been arranged and orchestrated by his mother rather than chosen by his heart, that he was choosing her, Clara Brennan, freely and consciously. The words hung in the air between them, and Clara felt something crack open within her chest, a possibility that had always seemed impossibly distant suddenly looming into terrible proximity. She wanted to believe him. That was the dangerous part. She wanted to believe that this man, this extraordinarily beautiful and powerful man, was capable of seeing beyond her scars to something worthy of love, and that desire terrified her more than the fire ever had. She refused him repeatedly over the course of the next week as she recovered and was eventually discharged from the hospital to convalesce at the Whitmore mansion. Each refusal seemed only to strengthen his resolve. He would sit beside her during her recovery, and he would speak to her about his life, his disappointments, his sense of living according to a script written by others rather than by his own hand. He spoke of the emptiness of beauty without substance, of the suffocation of privilege without purpose, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, Clara's resistance began to erode like stone worn smooth by constant water. The proposal, when she finally accepted it, came not as a triumph but as a surrender. She accepted because she loved him, and because to refuse him any longer felt like a cruelty she could no longer commit. She accepted knowing that it would create scandal, that it would invite condemnation from every quarter of society, that it might very well destroy him professionally and socially. But she accepted because the alternative was a lifetime of denial, and she had already learned through fire and suffering that life was too fragile to spend it refusing genuine feeling when it offered itself. When the announcement of their engagement was made public, New York society erupted in a chaos of speculation and condemnation that would transform everything. The small church on the outskirts of Manhattan stood silent and austere in the gray December afternoon, its stone facade weathered by years of New York winters and indifferent to the drama that was about to unfold within its walls. Clara knelt in the vestry, her hands trembling as the seamstress made final adjustments to her wedding gown, and she found herself unable to believe that this moment was actually arriving, that the impossible was transforming into reality with the inexorable momentum of a locomotive barreling down iron tracks. Her wedding dress was not the elaborate confection of lace and silk that society expected for a union of such consequence. It was simple, elegant, constructed from the finest white silk damask with long sleeves and a modest train. Clara had insisted on this simplicity, had resisted Harrison's offers to commission an elaborate creation from the most exclusive dressmakers in Paris. She wanted nothing that suggested pretense or false elevation. The only concession to ornamentation was a delicate lace collar that framed her neck and shoulders, a choice she had made deliberately. She would not hide her scars on her wedding day. She would not begin this union by denying the truth of what she was. Her auburn hair had been arranged in a simple style, swept up and adorned with white flowers of such fragile beauty that they seemed almost unreal. She wore no veil. That choice had prompted considerable consternation among those who believed that traditional ceremony should mask uncertainty and fear. But Clara had decided that she would face whatever came with her eyes open and her face visible. If she was to be condemned by society for marrying a man as powerful and wealthy as Harrison Whitmore, then at least they would see her clearly as they did so. The guest list for the ceremony numbered barely 30 souls, a stark contrast to the elaborate affairs that characterized New York society weddings. Margaret Whitmore had refused to attend, sending instead a formal letter that expressed her disapproval in language so coldly precise that it seemed to embody the temperature of her displeasure. The Ashford family had similarly declined, though their refusal carried undertones of fury that Margaret's contained only calculation. Of Harrison's business associates, only a handful had accepted the invitation, and their presence seemed motivated more by personal loyalty than by social approval. Dr. Chen sat in the front pew, his presence a quiet affirmation of his support for this union. James Whitmore occupied the seat beside him, his expression carrying a mixture of emotions that seemed to encompass confusion, loyalty, and genuine care for his brother's well-being. A small group of servants from the Whitmore household had been permitted to attend, and Clara found herself overwhelmed by their presence, particularly when she recognized Mrs. Donnelly, the cook, whose eyes shone with unshed tears of emotion. When Clara emerged from the vestry and proceeded toward the altar, the church fell into an absolute silence that seemed almost supernatural in its completeness. She moved down the aisle with deliberate slowness, acutely aware that every pair of eyes present was examining her, assessing her, judging the appropriateness of this union that society had already pronounced catastrophic. She kept her gaze fixed on Harrison, who stood at the altar waiting for her, and what she saw in his expression made everything else, the whispers, the scandal, the condemnation, fade into insignificance. He was looking at her as though she were the most beautiful thing he had ever witnessed, as though the simplicity of her dress and the absence of artifice in her presentation represented perfection rather than restraint. When she reached him and he took her hand, she felt the trembling that ran through his fingers, and it steadied something within her own heart. Whatever doubts she harbored about whether this was real, whether his love could possibly be genuine, dissolved in the warmth of his grip and the tenderness of his gaze. The vicar who conducted the ceremony was an elderly man who had served the Whitmore family for decades, a man who seemed to view this union with a combination of resignation and compassion. He spoke the familiar words of the Anglican marriage service, and when Harrison and Clara exchanged their vows, there was a weight to their words that seemed to transcend the traditional phrasing. When Harrison promised to love, honor, and cherish Clara, His voice carried a conviction that echoed through the stone church like a declaration of war against every force in society that would deny them. When Clara promised to love and honor Harrison in sickness and in health, in fortune and in adversity, she felt the truth of those words settle into her bones. She was committing herself not only to Harrison, but to a future that was fundamentally uncertain, to a position in society that would likely never be fully accepted, to a life lived in defiance of conventions that had governed her entire existence until this moment. The wedding breakfast that followed was held at Harrison's estate outside the city, a deliberate choice to avoid the scrutiny of New York's hotels and clubs. The meal was elegant but modest, the atmosphere subdued despite the formal dress of the guests. The toasts offered by James and Dr. Chen carried undertones of significance that went beyond the customary pleasantries. Both men seemed to be making declarations of support and acceptance in the face of a world that had already begun orchestrating its disapproval. It was during the cake cutting that the first hint of the storm to come arrived in the form of an ostentatious floral arrangement delivered by a servant who had clearly been instructed not to reveal its sender. The arrangement was excessive in its scale and its cost, an obviously expensive display of white lilies and roses arranged with calculated precision. The card that accompanied it read simply, "To the bride and groom, a match made in hell." The message hung in the air like poison gas, and though no one spoke its contents aloud, everyone present seemed to sense that this union had made an enemy of someone powerful and determined. That evening, after the guests had departed and the household had settled into quiet, Clara found herself alone in what would now be her bedchamber. A luxurious space of pale silk wallpaper and mahogany furniture that seemed to belong to someone other than herself. She wore a nightgown of finest white cotton, and she sat before the mirror, examining her reflection with the critical eye of a woman attempting to reconcile the woman she had been with the woman she was becoming. When Harrison entered, his knock on the door was tentative, his expression carrying a vulnerability that she had never seen in him before. He approached her slowly, as though she might shatter if handled without extreme care, and he knelt before her chair so that their eyes were level. With infinite gentleness, he reached out and traced the scars on her neck with his fingertips, a gesture that should have been uncomfortable, but instead felt like an act of profound reverence. He told her that her scars were beautiful, that they were marks of her courage and her strength, that they were part of the woman he had chosen and would continue to choose with every fiber of his being. In that moment, in the quiet intimacy of their wedding night, Clara allowed herself to believe that perhaps love truly could be real, that perhaps this man truly saw her, truly valued her, truly chose her not despite her scars, but alongside them as an integral part of who she was. If this story already made you sigh, leave a like. Every gesture from you helps other souls discover the beauty of love from days gone by. The new year arrived in 1883 with a brutality that seemed almost personal in its targeting of Clara's fragile acceptance into Harrison's world. The society pages that had initially treated the Whitmore marriage as a shocking scandal worthy of mockery began to shift their coverage towards something more insidious and calculated. Vivian Ashford, operating from the drawing rooms and tea services of New York's most influential families, had orchestrated a campaign of such precision and venom that it would have been impressive if it had not been so devastating in its execution. It began with seemingly innocent observations. At the Metropolitan Opera House, where Clara and Harrison attended a performance of Italian opera, Vivienne positioned herself and her circle strategically in boxes where they could be overheard by the right people. She spoke with theatrical concern about the strange hold that Clara seemed to have over Harrison, speculating aloud about whether a man of his standing could possibly be making sound decisions when his judgment had been so clearly compromised by infatuation. The words were delivered with the perfect calibration of false sympathy, designed to plant seeds of doubt in the minds of everyone within earshot. At a charity benefit organized by the Ladies' Auxiliary of St. Patrick's Cathedral, a prominent society hostess deliberately passed Clara a tray of refreshments meant for servants, her face registering an expression of theatrical shock when Clara's identity was revealed. The apology that followed was so excessive in its condescension that it effectively communicated that Clara's presence in such elevated spaces remained fundamentally inappropriate, that her elevation to the status of Mrs. Whitmore had failed to transform the essential fact of her unworthiness. Clara felt the eyes of every woman in the room upon her, assessing her response, judging whether she would attempt to defend herself or accept the humiliation with meek resignation. More damaging still were the whispers that began to circulate regarding Harrison's business judgment. Vivienne, through carefully placed conversations and strategic deployments of information, began suggesting to Harrison's business associates that his recent marriage had destabilized him emotionally, that his decisions had become erratic and driven by sentiment rather than sound calculation. She implied, without quite stating, that perhaps he was being manipulated by Clara, that perhaps a woman of her background possessed skills in seduction that had rendered him susceptible to poor decision-making. The impact on Harrison's business ventures became increasingly visible as the winter months progressed. A major shipping contract that had seemed certain fell through when the other party's family expressed moral disapproval of Harrison's marriage and refused to conduct business with a man whose judgment they questioned. An important partnership in railroad development dissolved when one of the principal investors made clear that he could no longer afford to be associated with someone who had scandalized himself so thoroughly. Each loss seemed to feed upon itself, creating a perception that Harrison's position, far from being unassailable, was beginning to crumble. Clara witnessed these developments through the careful observations of servants and the guarded conversations she overheard when people believed her to be out of earshot. She began to understand the true cost of her union with Harrison, began to confront the reality that her presence in his life, rather than bringing him the happiness he claimed to feel, was actively destroying the professional accomplishments that had defined his existence. The guilt that accumulated within her grew heavier with each passing day until it felt almost crushing in its weight. The crisis reached its peak when Clara discovered correspondence from her mother-in-law's lawyers. The letter, which she found on Harrison's desk when she was seeking information about dinner arrangements, made the magnitude of the disaster clear. Margaret Whitmore, operating through intermediaries, had been in contact with representatives of one of New York's most prestigious law firms regarding the possibility of an annulment. The letter outlined the strategy with clinical precision. Harrison's marriage would be presented as the product of temporary derangement brought on by trauma. Clara would be offered a significant financial settlement in exchange for her consent to the dissolution of the union. The amount specified in the letter was substantial, a sum that would have allowed Clara to live comfortably for the remainder of her life, to disappear quietly into anonymity and obscurity. The letter further suggested that such an arrangement would be in the best interests of all parties involved, that it would restore Harrison to his previous social and professional standing, that it would allow him to pursue a marriage more appropriate to his station. Clara read the letter 3 times, each reading seeming to drive the knife deeper into her heart. She understood with absolute clarity that accepting this offer was the only moral course of action available to her. She understood that Harrison's future, his business, his reputation, and his position in society all depended on her removal from his life. She understood that her love for him demanded that she release him from the obligation he had undertaken, that she allow him to reclaim the life that her presence had disrupted so thoroughly. That night, while Harrison slept, Clara made her preparations with methodical precision. She packed the few possessions she had brought to the Whitmore household, declining to take any of the elaborate gowns or jewelry that Harrison had purchased for her. She composed a letter attempting to explain her decision, attempting to make him understand that she was doing this out of love, that she could not bear to watch him sacrifice everything for her, that her own worth did not justify such destruction. She made her way through the silent corridors of the mansion in the pre-dawn hours, her heart breaking with each step. She had nearly reached the door when his voice stopped her, quiet but absolute, speaking her name in a tone that contained such desperation that it seemed almost to shatter the foundations of the house itself. The dawn broke over New York City in shades of pale gold and gray, indifferent to the emotional upheaval that had consumed the Whitmore household through the night. Harrison had held Clara in his arms as she wept, had told her with a ferocity that left no room for doubt that he would not permit her to leave, that they would face whatever came together, and that his refusal to allow her sacrifice was not weakness but the most profound act of love he could offer. By morning, a decision had crystallized within him, a plan of such boldness that it seemed almost reckless in its audacity. Within days, Harrison summoned the most important figures in his business empire to a meeting of such consequence that its announcement alone sent tremors through New York's financial district. He gathered in his private study the men who represented his most significant partnerships, the associates and colleagues who had built their fortunes alongside his own. His expression, when he addressed them, carried the iron certainty of a man who had made a decision that would reshape his entire life, and he communicated that decision with absolute clarity. He was restructuring his business interests, he announced. He was withdrawing immediately from partnerships with several key figures, specifically those individuals and families who had expressed moral disapproval of his marriage. The message, delivered without apology or explanation, reverberated through the room like a thunderclap. These men had expected him to defend himself, to justify his union, to perhaps suggest that he might be persuaded to reconsider his commitment. Instead, he was telling them that their disapproval had consequences, that association with Harrison Whitmore now required acceptance of Clara as his wife. The economic impact of his decisions began to manifest almost immediately. Harrison established new business ventures with partners who respected his judgment and shared his conviction that personal integrity should supersede social convention. Dr. Chen, whose medical expertise had been confined to his professional practice, became an investor in Harrison's plans for a new medical facility that would provide care to the poor and working classes of New York City. James Whitmore, who had been operating in the shadows of his brother's enterprises, suddenly emerged as an active and equal partner in several new ventures. A shift that suggested a fundamental recalibration of power within the Whitmore business empire. The narrative that Harrison constructed regarding his marriage was deliberate and carefully calibrated. He began, subtly but persistently, to present Clara to society in contexts that highlighted her intelligence, her grace, and her genuine interest in the welfare of others. He invited to his home a select group of younger women whose progressive sensibilities made them more amenable to questioning conventional wisdom. During these intimate gatherings, Clara's kindness and thoughtfulness became evident, her quick wit and surprising erudition impossible to dismiss. More significantly, Harrison began to actively counteract the rumors that Vivienne had so carefully cultivated. He did this not through direct confrontation, but through the simple act of living publicly with integrity and conviction. He appeared regularly with Clara at charitable events, at cultural functions, at gatherings where her presence would be witnessed by significant portions of New York society. He looked at her with such obvious affection and respect that the narrative of manipulation and seduction that Vivienne had constructed began to seem increasingly implausible. Vivienne's vendetta, meanwhile, began to unravel with the inevitability of a tapestry pulled at by a single loose thread. Her own family, increasingly embarrassed by her obsessive campaign against Clara, gradually withdrew their support. Her father, Robert Ashford, made clear in conversations with various associates that he could no longer endorse his daughter's behavior, that her fixation on destroying Harrison's marriage suggested an instability of character that concerned him greatly. The social machinery that had propelled her influence began to stall and reverse direction with surprising speed. The turning point arrived with a woman whose story seemed almost orchestrated by fate itself to demonstrate the profound inadequacy of society's judgments regarding worth and beauty. Mrs. Eleanor Vanderbilt, one of New York's most prominent society matrons, experienced a personal tragedy when her young daughter suffered a severe burn accident that left significant scarring on the child's face and neck. The mother was devastated, convinced that her daughter's future had been destroyed, certain that the child's prospects for a respectable marriage and an acceptable social position had been obliterated by the accident. It was at a charity event that Mrs. Vanderbilt encountered Clara privately, and in that encounter something profound occurred. Clara spoke to this woman who was drowning in anxiety and despair with a gentleness born from intimate understanding of the territory Mrs. Vanderbilt was attempting to navigate. She spoke of scars with a wisdom that transcended platitude, about the insignificance of physical appearance compared to character, about the possibility of a full and beautiful life despite disfigurement. She shared her own story with such vulnerability and strength that Mrs. Vanderbilt found herself weeping, not from despair, but from recognition that her daughter need not be condemned to a life of diminishment. Within weeks of that conversation, Mrs. Vanderbilt had transformed into one of Clara's strongest advocates within society. She began attending events specifically to publicly demonstrate her support for the Whitmore marriage, and her influence, considerable and deeply respected, began to shift the perception of Clara within the highest circles of New York's elite. Margaret Whitmore's transformation was slower and more complex, emerging through a series of private conversations that were conducted with careful, emotional restraint. She visited Clara in Harrison's study one afternoon with an ostensible purpose, but discovered instead a woman whose quiet dignity and genuine integrity could not be dismissed or diminished through conventional weapons of social control. Clara did not attempt to win Margaret's approval or to defend herself against the older woman's implied accusations. She simply expressed her understanding of why Margaret disapproved, acknowledged honestly that she would never be the daughter-in-law Margaret would have chosen, and stated that she asked only for tolerance, not acceptance or affection. Something in Clara's refusal to perform the role of the apologetic, desperate daughter-in-law seemed to penetrate the fortress that Margaret had constructed around her heart. The older woman, who had spent her entire life wielding power through disapproval and control, encountered a person who did not require her approval to possess dignity and worth. Margaret began, hesitantly and imperfectly, a process of reconciliation that would transform from grudging tolerance into something approaching genuine respect. The culmination of this shifting narrative occurred at a major society event, where Clara and Harrison made their first public appearance together since the scandal had reached its height. As they entered the ballroom together, a profound silence fell across the assembled company. The moment stretched, suspended between social rejection and acceptance, hanging like a sword above them. Then Dr. Chen rose from his position among the guests and began to applaud. James Whitmore joined him immediately. Other guests, tentatively at first and then with increasing confidence, began to follow. It was not universal acceptance, and pockets of disapproval remained visible in certain quarters of the room, but it represented a decisive turning point. Clara was no longer invisible or universally condemned. She had become simply Mrs. Harrison Whitmore, a woman of genuine worth who bore scars that testified to her courage rather than her shame. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone you love. That way, we'll know that the romances of the past still live in the hearts of today. The autumn of 1884 arrived with a gentleness that seemed almost forgiving, as though the seasons themselves had decided to grant mercy to those who had suffered through the trials of the preceding year. Clara stood in the morning room of the Whitmore mansion, her hand resting lightly against the window pane as she observed the transformation of the gardens below. The leaves were beginning their annual descent into gold and crimson, and she felt within herself a corresponding sense of transformation, a recognition that the woman she had been 2 years ago, invisible, ashamed, believing herself unworthy of love, had undergone a metamorphosis as complete as any butterfly emerging from its chrysalis. Her involvement in charitable work had become the defining passion of her existence beyond her marriage. She had established, with Harrison's financial support and Dr. Chen's medical expertise, an organization dedicated to serving individuals who bore the physical and emotional scars of burns and disfigurement. The work was demanding and often heartbreaking, but it was also profoundly meaningful. Clara used her own story not as a source of shame, but as a bridge of understanding with others who had experienced similar trauma. She worked with factory owners to advocate for improved safety regulations, her efforts informed by intimate knowledge of the consequences of negligence and insufficient precautions. Harrison's business had not merely recovered from the upheaval caused by society's initial disapproval of his marriage. It had flourished in ways that seemed almost to validate his decision to prioritize principle over expediency. His willingness to withdraw from partnerships with individuals who lacked moral integrity had attracted a new caliber of business associate, men and women whose respect for his judgment ran deeper than the superficial calculations that governed most of New York's financial world. Several major new ventures had proven extraordinarily profitable, and his reputation, far from being destroyed by his marriage to Clara, had been transformed into something stronger and more resilient. Margaret Whitmore attended the quarterly meetings of Clara's charitable organization with a regularity that would have been unthinkable 2 years prior. She made substantial personal donations and had begun to speak publicly about the organization's mission with an advocacy that suggested genuine conviction rather than mere social obligation. She treated Clara with the courtesy due to a valued family member, and though she would never become effusive in her affection, the respect she offered was real and hard-won. James Whitmore had commented, with gentle humor, that their mother seemed to have discovered a new purpose in life through Clara's work, that the focus on charitable endeavors had softened something rigid and controlling in her character. Vivian Ashford had faded from New York society with a completeness that seemed almost to suggest she had never existed at all. Her family had eventually arranged a marriage to a respectable gentleman from Philadelphia, a union that seemed to have been orchestrated as much to remove her from the New York social scene as to secure her future. She rarely returned to the city, and when she did, she moved through social circles with a caution that suggested she had learned, through painful experience, the consequences of underestimating the power of authentic connection and genuine integrity. Some said that her obsessive vendetta against Clara had damaged her reputation permanently, that she would never again possess the social influence she had once wielded so carelessly. On a spring morning in 1884, Harrison and Clara walked through the gardens of their estate, a property that had become increasingly important to them as a refuge from the demands of the city. Clara had removed the high collars and careful styling that had once been her habitual method of concealing her scars. She now wore gowns whose necklines allowed the scars to remain partially visible, marks that she had come to regard not as disfigurement, but as testimony to her courage and her willingness to sacrifice for others. A servant girl whom Clara did not immediately recognize approached them on the path, and Clara saw in the girl's downcast eyes and careful positioning of herself something achingly familiar. Without hesitation, Clara stopped and spoke to the young woman with a gentleness born from personal understanding. She learned that the girl had recently arrived from Ireland and was struggling with the invisible weight of inferiority that had nearly crushed Clara's own spirit years ago. Clara made a quiet but firm note to ensure that this servant would be treated with particular kindness and respect by the household staff, that her dignity would be protected and nurtured rather than systematically diminished through the casual cruelties that society inflicted upon those deemed to occupy the lowest positions. As Clara and Harrison continued their walk, they discussed their future with the ease of two people whose love had been tested and strengthened by adversity. Clara was expecting their first child, a reality that had filled them both with a joy so profound that it seemed almost to transcend the ordinary emotions of expectation and anticipation. They spoke of the kind of parents they hoped to be, of the values they wanted to instill in their children, of their desire to create a household where worth was determined not by social position or physical appearance, but by character and integrity. That evening, they hosted an intimate dinner party that brought together the various threads of their transformed lives. Dr. Chen arrived with the warmth of a trusted friend and confidant. James Whitmore came accompanied by his own betrothed, a woman of progressive sensibilities who had become friends with Clara through their shared involvement in charitable work. Mrs. Eleanor Vanderbilt attended with her daughter, now a young woman of remarkable grace, who bore her scars with a composure and dignity that demonstrated the power of maternal support and societal acceptance. Margaret Whitmore presided over the table with a dignity that suggested genuine pleasure in the gathering of people she had come to respect. As Clara sat at the head of the dinner table, her hand occasionally touching the gentle swell of her expectancy, she observed Harrison watching her with an expression of such absolute contentment that it seemed almost to fill the room with light. This man who had chosen her, who had stood firm against the condemnation of an entire society, who had insisted on her worth when the world had voted overwhelmingly for her insignificance, was looking at her as though she were the most precious thing he had ever possessed. The scars on Clara's neck and shoulder, now visible in the candlelight that played across her bare shoulders, seemed almost to glow with a significance beyond their physical presence. They were marks that told the story of a woman who had refused to disappear, who had insisted on her own value, who had discovered that courage came in many forms, and that the most profound heroism often emerged not from grand gestures, but from the simple act of persisting, of believing in oneself when the world insisted on denial. In the years that followed, the story of Harrison and Clara Whitmore would become the subject of endless speculation and analysis within New York society. Some would attribute his marriage to a temporary madness, others to the particular susceptibility of powerful men to emotional manipulation. But those who knew them, who observed their partnership across years of shared purpose and genuine affection, understood that something more profound had occurred. A man who had everything society deemed valuable had discovered that true wealth lay not in accumulation, but in connection. That authentic love required seeing another person completely and choosing them anyway, with full knowledge of their flaws and their struggles. and a woman who had believed herself utterly unworthy had learned that her value had never been dependent on society's judgment, that her scars were not marks of shame, but testimony to her resilience, that love, when genuine, did not diminish her by elevating her, but rather honored her by acknowledging who she truly was. Together, they had created a life that transcended the categories into which society attempted to place them, a love story that would endure far beyond the fashions and scandals of their era, a testament to the possibility that authentic connection could transform not only two individuals but the world around them, one kindness at a time, one act of courage at a time, one refusal to accept society's narrow judgments at a time. The autumn of 1892 arrived with a gentleness that seemed to honor the passage of time and the transformations it had wrought. Clara stood in the library of their Fifth Avenue mansion, watching as afternoon light filtered through tall windows and illuminated the space where she had first glimpsed Harrison all those years ago. The room had changed, as had everything, yet something essential remained unchanged. The sense of possibility of a life lived with intention and purpose. 3 children now occupied the rooms of the Whitmore household. Eleanor, their eldest daughter, had inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's commanding presence, along with a compassion that seemed to flow from some deeper well of understanding. She was 8 years old and already showed signs of possessing her mother's quiet strength. The twins, Harrison and Charles, were 6, and they embodied the energy and confidence of children raised in a home where love was expressed through action as well as words. Harrison had aged with remarkable grace, his dark hair now streaked more liberally with silver, his face bearing the lines of a man who had lived fully and without regret. He had achieved a success in business that had exceeded even his early accomplishments. But more significantly, he had achieved something far rarer, a life aligned with his deepest values. His steel mills had become known throughout the country for their progressive labor practices and their commitment to worker safety, standards that had been inspired by Clara's passionate advocacy and his own conviction that profit need not come at the cost of human dignity. Clara had transformed in ways that extended far beyond the physical. The woman who had once believed herself invisible had become a voice of considerable influence within New York society. Her charitable organization, now formally established and funded by contributions from some of the city's wealthiest families, had saved countless individuals from the despair that society's judgment might otherwise have inflicted upon them. She had written articles for prominent journals about the nature of beauty and worth, had spoken publicly about the arbitrary cruelty of social hierarchies, and had, through her own example, challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which Gilded Age society had constructed its most rigid categories. The scars on her neck had become famous in their own right, visible reminders of a woman's courage and a man's refusal to accept society's judgments regarding worth. Young women who bore their own marks of trauma, whether physical or emotional, sought her out for counsel and support. She received letters from across the country, from people who had read accounts of her story and found in it permission to believe in their own value, despite the world's insistence on their unworthiness. Margaret Whitmore had passed away in 1889, leaving behind a legacy more complex than she had perhaps intended. In her final years, she had become increasingly involved in Clara's charitable work, and she had left to the organization a substantial bequest that ensured its continuation and expansion for decades to come. Her death had brought genuine grief to Clara, who had come to respect and even affectionately regard the woman who had once been her most implacable enemy. Harrison had wept at his mother's funeral, tears that spoke to the complicated love between parent and child, to the possibility of reconciliation even after years of conflict. James Whitmore had married and fathered children of his own, and his business partnership with Harrison had flourished into an enterprise of such scope and significance that it had fundamentally altered the landscape of American industry. He and his wife remained close to Clara and Harrison, their families intertwining through years of shared holidays and celebrations. Dr. Chen, now in his 60s, had become one of the most respected physicians in New York City. His friendship with Harrison and Clara had deepened into something approaching family relationship, and he served as the godfather to their eldest child. He had never married, but his life had been filled with purpose and connection, his dedication to his patients reflecting the same values that had drawn him into friendship with the Whitmores. Vivian Ashford had lived a life that seemed almost designed to demonstrate the consequences of choosing bitterness over growth. Her marriage in Philadelphia had produced no children, and she had gradually withdrawn from society entirely, living a life of increasing isolation and regret. Those who had known her in her youth spoke of a woman who had sacrificed everything, beauty, influence, position, on the altar of vengeance, and who had gained nothing in return but the knowledge of what might have been. As Harrison entered the library and found Clara standing by the window, he moved to her side with the ease of a man who had spent 8 years perfecting the simple art of devotion. He took her hand, and together they stood in companionable silence, watching the autumn light transform the room into something almost sacred. That evening, as they prepared for sleep, Clara traced the lines of Harrison's face with a tenderness born from years of intimate connection. He caught her hand and pressed it against his heart, and in that gesture lay all the words that needed no saying: gratitude for her courage, recognition of her worth, acknowledgement of the extraordinary gift of being truly seen and chosen. The love that had begun in fire had endured through years of challenge, criticism, and change. It had not remained unchanged. It had deepened, grown more complex, had been tested by reality, and had emerged stronger. It was the kind of love that transcended romance, that had become woven into the very fabric of how they moved through the world, how they raised their children, how they served their community. In the autumn of 1892, in a mansion on Fifth Avenue, a man and a woman who had defied society's judgments sat together as evening fell, and they knew themselves to be infinitely, profoundly loved. My dear friends, we have journeyed together through the story of Clara and Harrison, a tale that reaches beyond the elegant drawing rooms of the Gilded Age to touch something timeless and universal within our own hearts. Their story whispers to us across the centuries with a message that our contemporary world desperately needs to hear. What we have witnessed is not merely a romance, though it is certainly that. We have witnessed a testament to the transformative power of seeing another person completely, flaws, scars, dreams, and all, and choosing to love them anyway. We have seen how a single act of courage can reshape an entire life, how integrity can triumph over social pressure, and how authentic connection can break through the most rigid barriers that society erects. Clara's journey from invisibility to recognition reminds us that our worth is never determined by anyone's judgment, but our own. The scars that she carried became not symbols of shame, but marks of her resilience and her willingness to sacrifice for others. In a world that constantly tries to convince us that we are not enough, not beautiful enough, not wealthy enough, not accomplished enough, Clara's story offers a profound counter-narrative. She teaches us that our value lies not in our appearance or our social position, but in our character, our courage, and our capacity for love. Harrison's decision to prioritize love over social expectation demonstrates that true power lies not in conforming to the world's expectations, but in reshaping those expectations through unwavering conviction. He lost nothing in choosing Clara. He gained everything that truly mattered. His business flourished, his character was strengthened, and his life became meaningful in ways that wealth and status alone could never have provided. The lessons embedded within this story are not confined to the 1880s. They speak to us today in our modern world, where social media has created new forms of judgment, where beauty standards are still narrow and exclusionary, where society still tries to convince us that we must fit into predetermined categories or lose our place entirely. This story invites us to question the judgments we accept without examination, to challenge the narratives that society tries to impose upon us, and to insist on our own worth, even when the world votes against us. It reminds us that love, authentic and genuine, is one of the most powerful forces available to us, not as an escape from reality, but as a lens through which to see reality more clearly and to transform it through our choices. I invite you now to join me in the comments section and tell me what this story meant to you. Which moment moved you most deeply? Which character's journey resonated most powerfully with your own experience? Write the word scars in the comments. This simple word will tell me that you have been with Clara and Harrison until the very end, and it will help me know that this story has found its audience, that the message of love and acceptance and authentic connection is reaching hearts that need to hear it. Please share this story with someone you love, someone who might need to be reminded of their own value, someone who has felt judged or excluded or invisible. Let this story ripple outward into the world, carrying its message of hope and transformation. In sharing it, you become part of the legacy of love and acceptance that Clara and Harrison created. On the cards appearing now, you will find links to other extraordinary stories from the Gilded Age and beyond, tales of love that defied convention, of women who refused to be silent, of men who chose principle over comfort. I invite you to continue this journey with me, to allow these stories from the past to illuminate the possibilities of our present and future. Thank you for allowing me to share this story with you. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your open hearts. Remember always, you are worthy of love exactly as you are. Your scars, whatever form they take, are not marks of shame, but testimonies to your survival and your strength. Until we meet again, dear friends, be kind to yourselves and to one another. The world needs your love, your courage, and your authentic presence now more than ever. With deepest gratitude and affection,